And I mean, just very quickly, do we have any apologies?
There are no apologies received tonight, Chair.
Well, for those of us, I mean, Chris Jarvis and myself, do we have any declarations of interest? I assume not. I take it as a no. What I'm going to suggest now, in the interests of allowing Ed to return to other things, Ed, would you like now to speak? It'll all be recorded for posterity. So would you like to introduce what you were going to say?
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, um, just just put my earphone in again. Just check you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Gosh, that's a relief. Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate your understanding with this. It's my lad's school play. You may have seen him going in, give me a little cuddle just before the live streaming started. I suppose I'm keen also to field any sort of questions of a political nature. So I'll leave time for that. I mean, maybe just a few comments on items on the agenda. If we would start with the monitoring report, there aren't, I think, huge surprises in that. There is the confirmation of a really difficult trend in terms of the temporary accommodation expenditure. And that is something we're taking into account in setting the budget, as you'll have seen. But it's something we're not shy about addressing, and our officers in that section. I think you've had a previous report on this, either yourselves or the housing panel, possibly all of scrutiny from officers about their various mitigating actions. I mean, we're clear that demand isn't falling. Instead, that it's where we have been able to bear down successfully on the costs. That's about the successful mitigation. So we need to keep working on that. The other area which I've discussed with Nigel and pushed him on a bit is making sure that we tread the right path in learning lessons from this. On the one hand, there are some areas where we need to include higher costs in the base. If a saving can't be delivered and it just can't, something like that, then that's what we'll do. On the other hand, we don't necessarily, some areas where we do want to deliver saving in future years, and we shouldn't just rebase our budget, but we're trying to do the right thing there. And treasury management, I think, is fairly self-explanatory, and I mean, a chunk of the substance of that comes from interest rate issues. And the ups and downs that happen with higher and lower interest rates. There is one area which has previously been on the confidential agenda, which is now on the public agenda, which is about the loss-free fund. That's now quite well known. A point which I think we always have to bear in mind when things don't work out as we would wish with funds, is that if we had a completely risk-averse approach to all of our investments, we would, on the one hand, never have nasty surprises, but on the other hand, we'd have less money than we do at the moment. And that is, even the case of the loss-free fund. If you look at what would happen if we simply stuck the money in the bank, we would be worse off as a local authority. That's not to say we want to be taking risks willy-nilly. I think we've got a decent balance at the moment. Be interested in the panel's thoughts in due course about the treasury management approach going forward. Another substantive report is around the supported accommodation. Glad actually for the request for that report, and I think it draws issues together. It's a really tricky area, and rereading it in preparation for this meeting, just an unhelpful government policy, and one which, to me, seems arbitrary in the extreme in the approach towards different providers. An RP sector which doesn't want to come forward and work in this area at the moment. Local charities who are excellent actually at provision, but can't necessarily meet the hurdles at the moment of becoming RPs, and complicated commissioning arrangements, plus just the difficulty of providing accommodation for vulnerable people in Oxfordshire. Put all those together, and it's a system which isn't working, but where there aren't any quick answers. There's not a quick fix here, colleagues, and so we just, in my view, but equally there needs to be a fix because the numbers are getting increasingly spectacular. And I think the recommendations in the report are sound, but you may well want to keep a watching brief on that. The other area one I'd flag is about the budget. You'll have seen we published that today. I'm looking forward to discussing it with the trade unions in the coming weeks. Also looking forward to our session, which I think is on the Thursday, I want to say, before Christmas, or when we're going to talk about it. And I know you've got other meetings programmed. I mean, my headlines are there. I won't rehearse them. I'll have my say at cabinet. But I think the one thing which I would take is around the fact in year one we are fine. You know, lots of authorities will essentially set a 1 year budget, and you know they'd love to set a 1 year budget like ours, but things do get significantly harder. The government is definitely, I think, clear about business rate reform and changing the way local government funding is allocated, and that may be difficult for us in future years. And of course, the fact that it's so long overdue means that there will be some potentially quite big shifts. We don't know yet. Of course, also the nature of the Oxford model just means we're reliant on dividends and interest payments, and we just don't know if all of those will come in. Some are secured, but many, a significant volume is not. And so the risk profile in later years is significant. But I'm sure that teaching grandmother to suck eggs, and that's something which you'll be considering in your deliberations when you look at the budget. And you know, as always, I really look forward to the scrutiny comments. They've been helpful. What I would say is the earlier you're able to give us a heads up on things that you want to say, the easier it is to include them, because we have a process of sort of political consideration in our group about what goes into the budget, and it's much easier to include comments if they come in advance of that. So, you know, we can treat things in a way which is quite private. We can treat them, you know, before they're published, or if they're still being thrashed out or whatever, but the earlier the better, really, the more traction you'll have. I think those are my political comments, James.
That's very helpful, Ed. I mean, one thing I was going to say, which is actually for the benefit of the other councillors, two are on the call at the moment, and I imagine Chris Smoten will join us any second. But I was going to ask, because we have another finance panel meeting on the 19th, by which time, well, just after that, I imagine lots of council staff will be going away Christmas, New Year. If we are to give officers time to respond to our questions about the budget, I'm going to ask, and I see Chris is there, sent an email, that can you please try discussing with Celeste, can you try to get questions on the budget? We'll need to coordinate them. I'll try and tie them together so we don't get duplication, but can you send them by the 9th? So it doesn't allow much time, but then we don't have much time to get them to officers, so they have a chance to prepare proper answers so that we can review it again on the 19th, and then we're ready to go immediately after New Year. So that's an important date to aim for. So I hope you can make a note of that. Otherwise, I will let other panel members ask questions. I've got a list, but they're quite detailed, so I'll save them until we have the discussion once you've gone to watch the play. So let's see who's got questions, looking for hands up. One of the Chris's? There we are. I'll take Chris Jarvis, then Chris Smoten. And by the way, I don't know that the other panel members saw Chris Jarvis is only on the call for about an hour or so. So we've slightly juggled the agenda items so that he can be able to participate in ones he's interested in. Chris Jarvis.
This isn't really a question for Ed, but it's just a follow up on your point, James, about questions for Budget Review Group. Just off the back of what you said, I think one thing that I found useful from previous years is to see the list of questions that we've submitted before, partially to strike out ones that we already know the answers to and aren't useful for us to be asking again, but also to see the questions we've asked previously that would be useful to rehash in new contexts. So I guess it's a request for either you, James, or Celeste, to recirculate those to panel members so that in advance of the 9th we can look through previous ones for inspiration.
That's a very good point. Okay, I'll discuss that with Celeste after this. Other Chris.
So I missed the very beginning of this, like the first 2 minutes. What genre of question are you looking for at this point? Because I've like literally this minute got to the end of reading the budget report and have sort of there individual line item type things. They're things along the lines of, like, to give an example, there's an ODS saving of around $500,000 a year that's about consultancy. What's that about? What sort of consultancy are we talking about? What was the money being used for before, etc.? Are we looking for that sort of question at this point, or you want to take those to budget review group?
No, that'll be taken to budget review group because we've got big items like the ODS revised plan and all the rest. And I think we would be here until very, very late if we tried to go now, because I don't know that any of us have, well, besides reading, have started to draft a detailed list of questions on the budget. So let's coordinate on those so that we have a consistent, comprehensive set of questions, which we can then fire off to officers. I think that's the best way. That's how we normally try to do it rather than piecemeal.
Sure.
If that's okay. I mean, I'll just let you know what seems to be the best current running order. I'm just looking on my screen. So we'll start with notes of the previous meeting because there are quite a few responses, but from the Cabinet, maybe we want to review that. Then we would go to the integrated performance report, which is agenda item 5. Then we go to item 6, which is to get Laura introduce the business rates non-payment and systems management. That's agenda item 10, but to have that as item 6 in our revised agenda. And then a supported accommodation, agenda item 11. So actually the integrated performance was agenda item 7, but Chris Jarvis is keen to be here for that discussion, so I was going to move it up. So maybe we will take that after we've done notes on the previous meetings, if that makes sense. I hope it's not too confusing. So we go notes on previous meetings, then we go business rates non-payment, and we have supported accommodation. So Laura and Richard, after those items, don't need to stay for the rest. And then we'll go to Treasury Management, and then we go to budget briefly, and then we go to the confidential section, which is the ODS, and so on, business plan refresh, which actually apparently fits in with the availability of the ODS officers and the Cabinet member. So that's what I propose we should do, if that's not too complicated. I hope that's okay with everyone. Yep, I take it that it is. So let's go now to the first of these items, which is just in the agenda pack, notes on the previous meeting. So I will invite
James. Ed's got his hand up, just so you know.
Oh, okay. I can't see all. I'm looking on my other screen. Okay, Ed.
James, I was going to be a bit cheeky and say I assumed that I probably wasn't needed from this juncture onwards, since there weren't any political questions addressed to me. And if you're happy to take my political comments as read, I will go and watch the mini Father Christmases or whatever it's going to be. Is that all right?
No, I think that's fine. I mean, it's nearly 15:15, so I think, I don't know when it begins, but probably you're going to get in late. Okay, thanks, Ed.
Right.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Pleasure's mine. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. So, okay, let's turn then to that. In this case, since it's notes of the previous meeting, I'm assuming that maybe the best way to proceed is, and I'll need to find it on my screen, but somewhere I have the agenda. Would people like to start off asking questions while I try and find it to look at it on my screen on ModGov? I need to find it somewhere. Oh, here we are. I found ModGov. Okay. So we'll start with, sorry, it's taking ages to scroll up. Okay. Sorry, bear with me. I need more screens. Getting there. So, okay. Nearly there. Actually, shall we quickly do the finance and performance work plan? I didn't have anything on that. Does anybody else have any comment on that? No, I take that as approved. So thank you very much. So let's now turn to what is in the pack called agenda item 6, which was the shareholder and joint venture group when we discussed executive pay. I don't think, Celeste, this is confidential, is this?
Pardon me, Chair, which page number are you referring to? If you
Well,
don't
I'm
mind
just
clarifying.
looking at it's actually from the notes, the old agenda item 6, which was on shareholder and joint venture group. I don't think there's anything confidential there. And the key thing, I think it's in the public domain what's there. The key thing was just to note the Cabinet's responses to our recommendations, which were yes in both cases.
I believe the reason they're exempt from public domain is because they refer to issues that concerns the companies, and normally their shareholder minutes are normally exempt from public.
Yeah, but this doesn't actually give really anything that's not already public away. I mean, these are already public, so I assume that's fine. I mean, we're going to have confidential one later at the end with ODS. So let's assume that's okay. Then we get the ODS group performance, which is which is on page 27. Were there any comments on, really it's on the Cabinet response there. I mean, and if you note, I mean, maybe I could say one very simple thing, is if you look at page 31, which is Appendix A, I'm assuming the answer is yes. Does the Cabinet agree? The comment seems to agree pretty much. So I hope that's correct. I think that's just a note. If you're scrolling through, as I was just then. Okay. Then we come on to the past integrated performance report. And the recommendation was agreed, and we're going to get the briefing papers, so that's very helpful. That's the one about housing benefit and so on. So we'll come on to that shortly. Then we had the Treasury Management Report. And again, the recommendation was accepted. We've got a good hit rate. And then we come on to agenda item 7, which is the one which is in Ed's name, but we have Nigel and we have Bill on the call, so they can probably answer any questions. So let's turn now to what is in our agenda pack, agenda item 7, it's page 41. And I will shall I invite you, Nigel, just to introduce this, or is it Bill?
Yeah, no, sure, James, I'll do a brief intro. So
Thank you.
The Q2 monitoring report as at the end of September, and the forecast outturn as at that date. Picks up general fund, HRA and capital. On the general fund, the overall forecast outturn is showing a adverse variance of just about 1.2 million, just over 1.2 million adverse at this point in the year. There are a number of variances that make this up, but there are three which sort of stand out. One is, you've already heard from Ed, is around temporary accommodation, basically. And the forecast as at this position was a £1.9 million overspend. I think it's fair to say that we're still working on that, basically. Obviously, the two factors of supply and demand. We're certainly working on the supply, and Richard's here. No doubt we could jump in, Richard, if there's any questions on that, basically. But obviously the demand as well, which we're still trying to cope with. But nevertheless, at this point in time, we're looking at a 1.9 million overspend. That's been largely offset by positive variance in respect of our corporate areas, most notably interest paid and earned. Where we've had slippages in the capital program, basically, this has meant a significant reduction in borrowing and therefore significant reduction in the amount of interest we've had to pay. Equally, with the high interest rates we've experienced over the last year or so, basically, we've had an increase in our investment interest. So that's created a positive variance, outturn variance of about 2 million. And then last but not least, we have the one again that Ed mentioned, which is subject to a paper which is on the agenda around supported accommodation. I won't go into that one. I won't steal Richard and Laura's thunder on there, basically. But as Ed says, basically that is probably a nuance of the housing benefit subsidy system sort of thing, and in connection with vulnerable tenants. And it's costing us a hell of a lot of money at the moment. So we'll probably come back to that later on in the agenda. In terms of the HRA, we're looking at about an overspend of about 2.4 million. The main area there basically is around repairs. The team continually have continuous discussions with ODS around the amount of repairs expenditure, but that continues to be quite overspending, quite a considerable amount actually. I suppose if you talk to ODS, basically they talk about the runaway nature and the sort of demand-led nature of some of these repairs budgets, basically. But it certainly doesn't help the situation. So at the year end, we would look to try and capitalize some of these repairs to mitigate some of this. But at the moment, that is probably the predominant feature, basically, which is making up the overspend in respect to the HRA. In terms of the capital program, so again, the figures before you basically overall show forecast spend of about 170 million. Spend to date, as at the end of September, was about 50 million actually. We've done significant work in this area to what we call deep dive on all the projects to get project managers to, as far as possible, accurately reflect their estimates of forecast outturn. But the position continues to sort of change basically, and I've no doubt when we come back again it will have changed again actually. But nevertheless, it's something that we do focus on quite considerably. The other area, basically, just to note in the report, is highlights the risk, both corporate risks and service risks. In respect to corporate risks, there's been very little change on the number of risks, around 11 of those, between amber and red. Service risks change probably more frequently, and you can see some of the changes which are highlighted in the report. I think that's all I need to say on the report, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions that you or the members may have. You're on mute, James.
You're still muted, James.
Shall we assume that questions is probably the solicitation?
I think carry on, Chris. Yeah.
Your first, other Chris.
Grant, I've got a few different bits and pieces, but I'll maybe start with hold on, let me just get my notes. Let me just start with the general fund, and then maybe we can theme general fund questions and then come back to the HRA and others. But on the general fund, I had a couple of questions. The first is on. Oh, James, you're muted now. The first is around car parking income. So the report says that car parking income's up by 8%, increase of around 500k. I guess this is a sort of partially forward-looking question going into this year's budget round. I'm sure you know what's coming, but that to me suggests that at least a question that we need to ask about whether we're charging the right amount on car parking in terms of is there a greater increase we could do this year that the market could bear in order to increase that income line further, without obviously the negative consequence you get when you prohibitively price and then you lead to a decline in income. I also would be interested to know. I haven't had a chance to look at the budget papers yet, but what's underpinning that, like which aspects of our car parking is driving that increase in income, whether there's a delineation between park and rides between on street and off street, etc. So that'd be useful to know. And my other general fund question was just on the TA front. The two figures that are in there in terms of the current projected variance of 1.8 million as opposed to the 3.3 million we were previously projecting, that's quite a big difference. A big positive difference in a sense, even though it's still an adverse variance. That seems like the mitigation steps that you've been talking about for a long time is having a success. And I guess then the question then going forward is, are we able to in the future begin to start to downgrade how much of that pressure we're budgeting for, given that although the volume of people in TA isn't decreasing, the nature of the TA we're putting them in and that being cheaper and the mitigation that you put in place is reducing the pressure. What's the implication of that for the upcoming budget round?
Okay. If I can come back on those, if I can get asked
Sorry,
Richard.
could I just, before you answer, Nigel, I'm going to ask, do other members of the panel, I have one or two, have comments on just this general fund on the this aspect? I see Chris Smoten has his hand up. Do you have, let's go through sort of section by section. Chris?
Yeah, so I have the same TA related stuff. More generally on staffing, there's several mentions of overruns relating to sickness and absence. And there's 2 or 3 mentions of overruns relating to recruitment difficulty. So the question on sickness and absence is, what rates do we assume by default? Should we be changing our default assumptions going forwards? Is there a noticeable change there in sickness or absence that's tending to happen? And on recruitment, I suppose again, is there a short-term thing there? Is there a pattern of people getting harder and harder to recruit? Do we have some insight into what's happening there?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ian, do you have anything to chip in at this point? I think we're looking at, it's hard with all these screens. I think we're looking at pages up to maybe, trying to see how far, well, 42, 43, around that area, yes.
No, nothing else at the moment. The temporary accommodation one is one that I think sort of mentioned a bit last time. So kind of, yeah, interested what the mitigations, and looks like they might be working on a lead on those. So yeah, some more to cover on that, but otherwise no, I'm fine.
Okay, thanks. If I may, so then we can pass it back to Nigel. One thing that would be useful, which you did in the end, just looking at presentation, which is quite important to understand a lot of data. One thing is I would like to see comparison of the, let's say, quarter by quarter, how the variances evolve. And you do that actually for the capital on page 45. I thought that was useful to see, how things are moving through the year. So I would request that, because here we don't see those changes, which do relate a bit to temporary accommodation, I'm sure. But more generally, coming on to specific points, I was interested, obviously, in the car parking. I'm interested to know what the demand elasticities we're assuming. We know what the price rises were, and for car parking, and the other one is garden waste. It seems that the increases have had a more muted demand response than we expected. I know Emma Gubbins, I spoke, and she's probably still responsible, but I suppose that is something we should put in as a question when it comes to the budget discussions. Another thing is, and I think that's implied by what Chris Jarvis said to begin with, if you look at, actually both Chris's, what you call rapid rehousing variances, I would be interested just to see, I suppose it's consistent with what I said about quarterly report, to see how those figures have changed over time, just to plot them over time, to see the success of the responses the council's made to this issue, and just to see, are we seeing a levelling off in all Is it consistent, just to be able to see how we're doing? So that was one set on that. And just, I suppose I'd like quickly just to go in on page 43, which is starting with business improvement. I'm just reading off the email I sent myself. It's clear that software costs go up over time. Question generally, do we factor that in the medium-term financial plan? I don't know. If you look at financial services, we are paying quite a bit for outsourcing on valuation fees, and it sounds as if this is a permanent issue, getting, if you like, agencies or whatever to do it. Is there a case, and this should then appear in the budget round, for another full-time officer or someone to do this? Because it's quite substantial funding there. On corporate finance, I'm sorry, I'm just running through. There's only one more after this. On corporate finance, it talks about higher bank charges, and it also talks about higher internal audit costs. I didn't understand the audit costs, but I'm sure you can explain. But presumably we're going to direct debits and the like in order to save costs on managing payments. So I want to know the upside as well as the downside, which is mentioned in corporate finance. And consistent with what I was saying about valuation in financial services, in property services, there seems to be a heavy reliance on agency staff. I think it's mentioned twice. I wondered whether we couldn't get ODS to step in and do that. So these were maybe slightly more specific ones when we come to page 43. But I mean, let's start off with the earlier ones, which cover things like car parking and temporary accommodation. So if I may, I'll go back to you, Nigel, maybe to answer some of these comments.
Okay. Okay. I think I've made a note of them all, Chair. Actually, I'll be looking for Richard for the TA ones. Actually, so I'll come to that in a sec. And Bill, if you could perhaps pick up the valuation one, because you probably know the answer to that one. But so striking them off as we go along in terms of the car parking. This is only the half year basically, and obviously we monitor this through the year. So by the time that we get to looking at the budget, basically, we will have more information. I think all I can say at the end of September, basically, we had seen an increase in park and ride income actually, and indeed when I set the budget, I put some increase in the base. So forget about increases in charges. Basically, what is the increase in the base? Because looking at a £500,000 increase, then you would expect there would to be some increase in the base budget basically to reflect that. So I've done that in the medium-term financial plan basically. How much we can carry on increasing charges? There is in the budget papers an increase in the hourly rates across all the city off-street car parks of 30 pence an hour. It's a bit of a dark art, or it's not scientific to try and calculate what the reaction is going to be to any increases. There was I think, was it 50 pence increase last time, basically. But we try and factor in, I think it's in the realms of about 10 to 15% as elasticity of demand into any increase in car parking charges. I say sometimes it works out perfectly, sometimes it doesn't. I suspect with the park and rides, basically, there are other factors at play, basically. Not least of all, sort of some of the traffic measures are being brought in, and obviously people are going more into the park and rides than they're off streets. But it's one which we will continue to look at, and I got no doubt when we come to the budget to say we'll have refreshed figures in terms of what those figures are looking like, basically, which we can play in. Richard, do you want to pick up the TA stuff just in terms of the questions around? Well, I'm going to start off by saying what have we assumed in the budget going forward? It is that 1.8, 1.9 million basically going forward, and we have reduced the amount from the 3.3 we were talking about previously. And indeed, when we first started out down the budget road, basically, we were at that higher amount, and we were looking at that higher amount for the period of about 3 years, basically. So that's sort of the figure I was starting on. But we've landed up about 1.8, 1.9 million put into the budget papers for the length of the 4-year period, the medium-term financial plan. In terms of the supply and demand as to why it's come down, Richard, do you want to pick that one up?
Yep. Yeah, so as Nigel says, favourable move since the start of the year. It is showing that the mitigations are working to help manage those costs. I won't go into all the details now, but we've got mitigations from the front end where we're trying to prevent demand with investment in prevention services on homelessness. On the back end, where we've put a number of mitigations in place to move people more quickly on from temporary accommodation, both into the social sector, and we've had a record year for many years for private rented sector lets as well. So we're getting more people out of TA and housed into permanent accommodation. And then in the middle, in terms of what TA we're using, we have a number of mitigations to basically move away from B&B hotel type TA to better homes for people that also cost less for the council. And over about a 2-year window now, we're currently forecasting about 200 extra TA units, if all goes well, across many different kind of strands, from private sector leasing to working with some of our big RPs to bring on stock and to use some of our existing stock differently to increase our TA. So we've got a good plan. It is showing to work, but working across housing services and financial services with Nigel and the team, we're still very cautious. We think we've got the best plans in place, but very small changes to the demand side can throw those figures wildly back off again into a negative territory. And I think it will be very much quarter by quarter. We'll have to see where demand goes. One of the main reasons why we've been able to kind of lower those forecasts is that we've successfully gone from 160 in hotel accommodation at the kind of about May time this year to about 110 now. But I've got to say it's been fairly flat for the last 2 to 3 months. So it may, and that is because of the ongoing demand. We're placing around 9 to 10 households into temporary accommodation every week at the moment, and to keep up rehousing 9 to 10 families on the other end to keep the flow going is extremely difficult to source that amount of accommodation in a housing market like Oxford. So cautious. We've got good plans in place, but we'll have to really see how it plays out in the months and quarters ahead of us, and then the years, because until that demand starts to come down and returns to more usual levels, I think we're going to continue to be exposed to a real risk of escalating costs again.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So just carrying on, James. So there's a question around staffing, and in particular, looking at finance staff and sickness and absence sort of thing. I think it's fair to say in financial services, we have had a considerable amount of staff who have been on ill health, especially in the finance teams and indeed revs and benefits as well. At one time, we were tracking at around 12 days per full-time member of staff, basically. And when, as you say, there's about 120 staff basically in the division, that 12 days is a considerable amount, and a considerable amount loss of production basically in those areas. So we have to bring in agency staff from time to time to backfill. Certainly in the payments team, we've done that. We lost the manager as well, basically at the same time through long-term ill health, and I lost another manager in that area as well. So it's not been an easy time basically for financial services, and you could say the same about revs and bens in that space as well, actually. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned whether we would get agency staff from ODS. I think this is obviously a different type of work. Basically, we tend to get our staff from Reed or indeed Northgate, basically for revs and bens staff. So we have to bring them in from time to time, and that's just to keep the business going. But is it a one-off? I'd like to think so. I'd like to think it is a one-off. We are getting back to realistic levels of staff absences, sort of thing. So I think from my point of view, in terms of finance, I'd like to think that we will get back on track very shortly. But over the last 12 months, it's not been easy, basically, especially given the high workloads in that area. You mentioned sort of quarter by quarter blow with the variances. Yeah, we can do that. And Celeste pops that in the sort of follow up. I can get that done for future reports. I talked about garden waste, garden waste and car parking in particular, because they're showing some increases here. I have actually, as I said earlier, on car parks and on garden waste, reflected an increase in the base budget, basically. So before any increases in charges, what is the increase in income that we are seeing? And indeed, on garden waste, we are seeing, don't know which way it is, inelastic or elastic demand, but the one that basically, if you put your charges up, your income doesn't go down, it goes upwards. And that's, we've seen some of that in garden waste. So that's been reflected in the budget papers going forward, basically. And we'll come on to that later on, I suspect, with the when we get into the budget questions, actually. Again, you talked about plotting figures over time, and we can get that information as well, specifically in respect of TA, and you can see our figures regarding that, and that will come in future reports. You mentioned about software costs. Yeah, in this report, I'm saying forecast outturn about 300,000 adverse. I expect that to go up a little bit, actually. In fact, I think the figure we put into the budget is, I'd like to say, about 450,000. These are, as we are renewing systems, the costs are going up, basically. There's an additional amount as well from changing systems to the cloud. You pay quite a bit more for cloud-based systems than you do for on-premise, i.e., where you keep the software on your own servers, or in our case, run by SCC out of Birmingham, actually. Eventually, there will be some payback as you get rid of more and more servers, basically. So you reduce the amount that you have on premise, you change systems to the cloud, and you start to relinquish costs on those servers. But it's not an immediate payback. It takes some time to do that. And it's probably only realized the bigger cost, basically, when you've transferred most or all of your systems onto the cloud, which is a project which we are undertaking. And we are looking to move our around 35 systems from on-premise provision into the cloud. So that's a major piece of work for IT and all teams to become involved with. Valuations, Bill, in terms of, well, we can't have the full-time officer. You're talking really on the property side, but Bill, have you got an answer to that one?
I think really the thing is that we have the valuations are all done at a point in time, so it's quite a significant amount of work to churn through, sort of in a short time frame. So what we have done historically anyway is we've had an internal person who's sort of coordinated and done some desktop valuations, but that's backed up by getting external valuations. I think we had a unfortunate staff loss in that area of the person who'd actually got the skills to do that. And really, we've had to put a lot more out than we did previously. As far as whether we could actually get somebody in to do it, I mean, theoretically, yes, but the amount of money that a valuer who can actually undertake the work and sort of bring some of it in-house, the sort of amount of money that they'd need is far higher than we'd pay. You'd start really skewing pay scales and end up with a member of staff who's probably paid more than the head of service. So that's really the kind of dilemma that we're caught in. Then there's a shortage of professional valuers as well, much the same as there is in a lot of professions. So, I mean, as far as the overspend, we also had a bit of, as councillors will probably be aware, there's been an issue around getting accounts finalised and signed off. So it's a bit of a double whammy in the 4 or 5 year, in that we've got kind of cost build-ups from previous years that is going in there because of when work has been completed and paid for. That should even itself out in future years. So again, that should be a one-off because we have now got a budget for doing valuations. I hope that's covered all of the points on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
And then the final one is just in corporate finance. So we have seen an increase in banking charges, and primarily I'm talking about credit and debit card payments as we move to more and more sort of electronic means of collection of cash and reduce the sort of cash payments going down. You're right that there have been some offset costs. So, for instance, we used to have a cash collection contract for our car parks, which was probably running at about 40,000 a year. That's probably down to probably less than 5,000 a year now, basically. We still have some residual areas that we collect cash from. It's not just car parking. There's some of our outer buildings that we take cash for. There are some aspects at ODS, for instance, which we pick up. So whilst there have been some savings, I'm seeing still quite an increase basically in those, and perhaps this is basically just a catch up of the actual charge for those banking services that I'd not put in the budget before, actually. In terms of internal audit, I think some of that will be one-off. I think there's increased volume from audits where they perhaps have slopped over from one audit year to another. We're having to pick up the cost here, basically. I suspect, if I'm a betting man, although we've recently gone out to tender for audit services, that the cost of those services will go up as we are currently in that retendering process. And I say this also probably reflects a little bit of catching up, basically, in terms of looking at the base budget and saying, well, it isn't sufficient to cover those costs anymore, sort of thing. So we've got a commensurate increase going on here. I think that's all the ones I wrote down anyway, James. Did I miss any?
Thank you. Let's move on to capital. I will now invite panel members to ask questions on capital. Chris Jarvis.
Sorry, it's not on capital, but the HRA comes first. I just wanted to. I've got
Please.
on the HRA. Yeah, thank you. So just quickly on the HRA front, obviously, Nigel, you mentioned introduction that repairs is the big area of variance in the HRA.
Yeah.
And I guess I have two questions on the specific lines that are in there. The first is around electrical upgrades. It says that electrical inspections are moving to a 7-year cycle from a 5-yearly cycle. I admit I don't necessarily understand what that means, but from my reading of that suggests that we're going to be doing inspections less frequently of electrical safety,
Yes.
which to me rings alarm bells from a safety perspective. So I just wanted to test that as to why that is and whether that's appropriate from a safety perspective. Appreciating that you might not necessarily be the right person to answer that, but I guess that there's an impact of that. And then my second question is on general minor works. Presumably this is stuff like a tenant has a broken tap and someone's sent out to fix the tap. Basically minor repairs within the housing stock. Presumably if there's an overspend in 1 year, there'll be an underspend in future years, because if things are being repaired, you'd hope that those repairs last. And then I guess the question then is, are we just unlucky in that more of this has fallen this financial year and that we can expect that line to decrease in future as a result of more things being newer, or is it an ongoing area of increased expenditure?
Yeah. Should I come back, Chair?
Yeah, why don't? Yeah, please proceed.
Okay. I think you're right, Chris. In terms of electrical inspections, I'm probably not the right person to ask. I mean, I'd like to think that there's not a health and safety issue here, basically, and they can be moved. I think if you note the question, I can go back and ask the likes of Malcolm Pete, basically, for an answer for that one, actually. In terms of the general works, I do know that this was one that was prevalent in the monitoring last year, basically, and was overspending. So I don't think this is one-off, basically. I think we continually seem to overspend this area. They are, as the nature suggests, one-off. They're not planned, basically. It's we need to do X or Y and we just charge it to this budget. And as it says there, it's demand led to a large extent. I know the property team or housing property team spend significant time in discussions with ODS about budgets and delegated budgets. But this one, I seem to recall, was prevalent last year basically, and it's prevalent again. So I'm not convinced that, you know, the money we spend here, albeit overspending, will lead to a reduction in next year. I am aware that there has been quite a big root and branch approach to setting of repairs and maintenance budgets, basically going forward to council properties, and more of that will be spoken about, I'm sure, in the budget round as we come on to looking at capital from April next year, basically. And I'd like to think it will pick up some of these issues, sort of thing, and either reset the budget or bring it under control, both better than it is at the moment.
Thank you, Chris. Coming back to you.
Yeah, just quickly to follow up on that, and I guess it's possibly a question for the budget review process. But I guess if Nigel, you're saying this is a budget line that is repeatedly overspending, then I guess the question then is, are we setting a realistic budget line around minor works if it's something that keeps going up over what we've budgeted? You've said that there's mitigations being put in place, but I guess, yeah, it's probably a question for budget review. But I guess just to note that now, that if it's multiple years it's happening, are we going to be sat around 12 months time going, oh, this budget line keeps being overspent? Yeah.
I think going forward, Chris, I think you will probably see in the root and branch approach that has been taken, this budget line will not exist. And, you know, so I don't think you'll see it exist going forward, because they've taken this more holistic approach, basically, and put a lot more stuff into planned maintenance. So I think it will be a useful question to say, we're aware minor works is continually overspending. Where does that feature now in terms of the reviewed capital program sort of thing? That would be something for the budget review process.
Well, since you're on, Chris, and you're leaving, I think, fairly soon, do you have any questions on the capital side?
I don't. I have a question on the risks section, but not on capital.
Okay. Anything on the capital from the other Chris or Ian?
One very quick one from me. The spreadsheet that looks at all the capital projects currently attributes all of the variation to slippage for every line item, including positive, which presumably would mean something slipped into the current year. That'd be like, you know, you're ahead of schedule and you're spending money you thought you'd be spending next year and so on.
Yes.
Is that just not done yet? Like at some point those will be categorized into that slipped versus that really has changed price and really will come in total over or under budget for one reason or another, as opposed to just moving around in calendar years.
I think it's exactly what you said, Chris. Actually, it's basically what we would term in the business as reverse slippage. It's bringing forward budget, so it can. I mean, we can separate it out, but it, you know, by the very fact it's a positive. Basically, you are bringing, you know, if it's in the slippage column and there is another column for overspends and underspends. If it's an overspend, then it's shown in the overspend column because the project is overspending. We don't get a lot of that, basically. If it's slippage, if it's negative, then you're slipping things backwards. If it's positive, you're slipping things forwards, basically. So you're saying the budget I put into next year, I want to bring some of it forward because the program is accelerating, basically. So that's the difference, basically. I mean, I'm not sure how I could show it any differently, but you know, I suppose I'm agreeing with what you're saying. I'm just saying I think it is shown correctly as it stands at the moment.
So I mean, it can't possibly be the case that not one of these projects is either over or underspent, but is that just an assessment that's to happen in the future?
Yes, that's probably fair to say.
It'd be a miracle if all these projects were coming in bang on.
Yeah, it'd be fair to say that. Yeah, the assessment at the end of the project more often than not, sort of thing. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. If I may, I've just got one or two on capital before we come on to the risk. One thing I noticed, if you look at it, the carry forward, which is 74 million, and the carry out, I think from the previous year, and the carry out of 65 million, in the scheme of things, are fairly similar. I'm just looking at what I wrote to myself.
Yeah.
So it sounds as if the slippage, the carry forward, it's like what you carry in, you tend to carry out in a similar magnitude. Now, I assume, am I correct, that you factored in already your 40% over optimism bias? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. But what you're demonstrating, or what you're acknowledging basically, is that you can do an optimism bias, but it only really takes effect in year one, basically, because what you slip 40%, you add that into the following year, and then you slip 40% of that budget plus the 40%, if that makes sense. So when you work it all through, basically, and you'll probably see it better in the budget papers actually when you come to it. But it doesn't make a lot of difference to the bottom line, basically. But we
No.
do, nevertheless, we do make an optimism bias of 40% basically in the budgets.
I mean, so to the extent that this all comes true, this is actually corroborating the support for the 40% in a way, because what's carried in and what's carried out pretty much match. I had just one other point, I must find it. I just wanted to know what the implication, because I fear this is going to be a negative variance. You said that the contractor pulled out of the Northfields hostel development. That's, I assume, being done ultimately, is it by OX Place? But what's the implication? Do you have any idea what the implication is? Because it's slightly odd if someone pulls out. We have to retender and pay more money. Is that the reality?
I think you're right. I don't know specifically, but that project is still going ahead, and therefore, if that contractor pulled out, then yeah, we would be retendering, and one would think basically that the costs are going to go up because we're at a different point in time as to when we set the original budget. So all of the budget has been slipped for this particular project. We will come back again, and it would be surprising if that budget doesn't change.
Okay, no, thanks. All right, let's now move on to the risk side that I think, was it definitely one or maybe both of you, Chris, has wanted to talk. Do you have anything on the risk side? Come on, Chris Jarvis, yeah.
Yeah, I think so I've got a question possibly on the obvious one, which is on the risk moving from green to red. I feel like sometimes we brush over this section of the report, but I feel there's certain alarm bells ringing at me on this one, just from the nature of the text, in that it says the ability to effectively deliver service required by the council to deliver and support statutory and non-statutory functions is significantly affected, which is a slightly alarming sentence to read. But I guess the question around this is, I guess, like, firstly, this is changed from the previous quarter, if I'm not wrong. So I guess what's the significant change that's happened in the last quarter that's made us decide that this was fine, an area that was fine 3 months ago and is now a red risk. And secondly, I guess the primary point is in relation to the ability to for recruitment and retention of lawyers. I guess the question I have is that, do we know whether this is a sector-wide issue or whether it's a Oxford City Council issue? Because those two things are very different in terms of how it might be mitigated and rectified in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that this is a sector-wide. There are a number of authorities experiencing problems with obtaining lawyers, basically. In terms of the ability to run, support statutory and non-statutory function, I think whilst that sounds a little bit emotive sort of thing, I think that's just saying basically the ability to deliver the work. And if we haven't got the staff, then obviously the ability to deliver work is going to be compromised actually and affected. I think it's fair to say in this area, basically, we put significant supplements basically onto all lawyer posts, basically, but there has been a big turnover, and lawyers can command a lot in the market, basically, and certainly if you're locum, basically, they are here today, gone tomorrow, actually. So yeah, it's a difficult area, and I know from speaking to Emma Jackman, basically, yeah, it's still something which is taxing her ability.
Anything else from you, Chris, or the other Chris, or Ian? No, if I may, I've just got a couple. I mean, in terms of the risk, I know you have your little sort of matrix, and you seem to have a way of ranking risk. I mean, one thing which I thought was inconsistent is you've reduced at the corporate level workforce sustainability, which I assume is to do with recruitment. That's been downgraded from red to amber, which isn't consistent with what we've just been saying. And yet in staff retention, it's there as a red service risk, staff turnover and so on, staff retention. So I just wonder, could someone please reconcile the corporate and the service risk in terms of retaining staff? And the other thing, I always say it, and I still believe it, I do not understand why for climate change we have two red risks, when in some ways I feel we should combine them in one red risk. There is a big risk around climate change. Seems always very, I know Bill will explain why you do it, but I still don't see, seems when we don't make other distinctions, which we could within segments. So that was just a general comment.
Yeah.
And maybe just last of all, actually is more on the tables at the end of this particular item. We've got nearly £500,000 capital down for the GULO, gully electric charging thing. And obviously, as far as I know, we do not know the outcome of our tender offer to the county, which is the commissioning agency. Is that all contingent on us getting the work? I just didn't understand, because almost none of it's been spent. That was just a specific question. There we are. So the risks don't seem to me to be consistent with one another.
I think in terms of the recruitment, my take on this would be there are certain services that are experiencing problems with staffing. I mean, building control would be another one, basically, on top of law and governance, actually. But whether they are sufficient to say that the whole authority basically is experiencing problems with staffing, I think, and therefore reflected in the corporate risks, I think that's a moot point. And the head of business improvement is responsible for that area, and has obviously deemed that is not sufficient to move that indicator in a similar way to what the service at service level has moved it. But Bill, have you got any other comments on that, or comments on the net zero one?
No, on the workforce, I think that's really it. It's the difference between whether something is affecting an individual service, which then goes into the service risks, and then for the corporate one, whether it's sort of endemic across all services or majority of. So yes, that is a judgment of the head of business improvement. Rightly or wrongly, and I think that can be fed back. Nigel can probably feed that back as to the comments. Climate change, yes, I have fed the challenge back, but the owner of the risk certainly feels that these are different enough risks to actually separate them. But again, I will feed that comment back and try and get some wording around that as to justification for having it as a separate risk, and then get something across to you.
Thank you. Am I right? Is that Mishtala who's
that's correct,
the owner, yes, of this risk or whatever?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I had just one general comment. You've responded to our request from last time about benchmarking the risks and so on. I thought that was very useful. I just wanted to note that. Thanks for getting it done. Okay. I think we've completed this. I've seen your note just now, Chris. Is that okay? Was there any other general point you wanted to make? I'll remind you of the 9th as the date for submitting questions for budgets. Okay, thanks. So I think Chris is off now. So now we can turn to Laura, who's been sitting very patiently there. And we're going to what was in the original agenda, I think, item 10, isn't that right? Would you like, please, to introduce? Yours are rather arcane areas, so I'd love to have you explain it again for our benefit. And are you taking control of the screen? No? Okay. Would you like to introduce it anyhow, please?
Nigel, I understand
Yeah.
from Phil that you was
just-
introducing, yeah.
Just to give us some overview, James, actually. Now, we sent an addendum through, and I think the addendum sort of start off with the debit. So how much, if you multiply the multiplier times the gross rateable value, what would be the total amount of business rates that should be paid by all businesses in the city? And that's the sort of starting position, basically. And that runs at about 290 million. So that's the sort of headline figure. Laura will pick up basically in terms of the reliefs basically that are given against that figure, and you'll see how much they impact on that figure. In fact, reduce it down to about £100 million in terms of the amount that we collect, and we can just explain a little bit about the different reliefs that we give, and indeed the government give basically in that area. The second area is around the collection. Obviously, of the £100 million, how are we doing on collection? And again, Laura can go through that element basically in terms of how we do, how we fare against other local authorities, and things that we write off, etc., etc. And then last but not least, the last part of the equation is how much do we get to retain of that? So you'll have heard about the retained business rate system I've mentioned before in budget sessions. And really, that is the amount that we can account for in our budget and in our revenue accounts. And it's really how is that calculated, basically. And again, perhaps Laura can touch on that as well. There's a few tables. But it is a very complicated area of the business, basically. And I won't even go into the collection fund where we collect all the monies, basically, and distribute it back out to the county council, because that gets even more complicated. But certainly the main three areas I think we can go through and just explain a bit like that. So is that okay, Laura?
Yes, of course. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, so Nigel is right. We have 4,600 properties in our area that we collect business rates for based upon the rating list. And the rating list is set by the valuation office. They give a rateable value, and then per every year, we send a bill out on the 1st of April, and we have 12 months instalments on average to collect that money in. Now, of that, we have 23 staff, and that's split over between assessment, to make sure we put the reliefs on and the appropriate liability in the charge periods, in comparison to those guys that we've got in recovery that take those effective methods that we need to, where people don't stick to their instalment plan. Now, when we look at liability, we have a variety of different options available to the council. We have a visiting officer, and as the report informs you, that visiting officer goes and literally pounds the streets, walks around, see if the property is in occupation or if the property is empty. And one of those reliefs that you can have is 3 months empty property relief. And then once the empty property relief has been concluded, it then goes back to the owner as a full charge from that period. And so we make sure we have some robust processes in place to monitor those empty property reliefs. An empty property relief, I'm literally just looking at my spreadsheet here, at the moment is costing us £56,000. And we've only got a couple of properties that are actually on that. Whereas previously, to give an idea of value, we only had 9 accounts, but that was 420,000. So that means that we've got some seriously large properties that were empty, and you're talking about shifting collectible debt from 420,000 being added back on because they've exceeded their 3-month period. So we're talking some large amounts of money is available to the council here from a collection point of view. We also have a contract with what's called Analyse Local, and they, in the report, as explains the principle of a drone. So they send drones up into the sky, and they go and have a look, and they will see if car parks change, if there's a structural building change, things that we possibly, if we were pounding the street, that we couldn't necessarily see. Yeah. Now, over the last year, that raised us £500,000, and it costs us £95,000 in terms of a contract, because every time they find a property that we're not aware of, there is a 20% charge back to us for that, in effect, finder's fee. So we use both of those two options to the council to make sure that we maximise the collectible debt into the council to make sure that we've got as much revenue possible for us for other council services. We also have to take into account the valuation office, and as I say, they obviously deal with the rateable value. We have no control about the amount that we charge. And for example, where we've got the changes on the Botley Road, we have absolutely, as a council, no control over that. With the train station, and occupiers of business premises should make sure that they maintain their charge and their payments towards the council, even if they're challenging what's called the rateable value, or if they believe their occupation is unfair, for example, because their footfall has been affected by the closure of the train station. But the valuation office is in a backlog, and as the report informs you, it's an average at the moment about a 9-month backlog, and that does make a difference in terms of the council. So although you look at collecting the current year, so what's the charge for 24-25, we also will have changes that could go right the way back to 2018, and that means that then the changes would be to a rateable value. It could go up or it could go down, which means then that there could be some businesses that will get a single instalment, because if the rateable value goes up, that will be a charge to go up, and in accordance with the regs, that's a single instalment to bring it back up to a zero balance. In the same way, there could be a cost to the council, because if the rateable value goes down, that could be a large credit that goes out the door. And the first thing that comes to my mind is Sainsbury's. They had a huge amount of credit go back to them. That was 460,000 last year, and that was just because their rateable value changed, because they took out a cash point machine out of their wall. So that's something in terms of cash flow that Nigel and his team in finance need to manage, because every week we do refunds and we change the collection debt going backwards and forwards. And the table in the report looks at that and says how obviously the money fluctuates in terms of the council finances, and we monitor that very closely. In terms of the cost of collection, on a national level, the council is very successful at collecting the debt. We have a target of 98% collectible debt. So going back to Nigel's earlier point of just about 200 million we have to collect, we actually look at 102 million after all of our reliefs go on, which actually equates to a 99% income stream before all those levies, as Table 1 explains, based upon a 98% collection rate. And that actually for business rates is at a cost to the council of approximately 420,000. So when you look at a return on investment, it is extremely successful. And we, as I say, we are middle to top quarter in terms of our collection rates. So that is pretty much it. Has anyone got any questions?
I'm looking to see if I have one or two questions, but Chris Smoking, yeah.
You mind saying a little bit about the old debt? I was a little bit surprised to find substantial amounts of decade-old debt apparently actually getting collected. That seems like the kind of thing which is, I mean, if somebody's not paid you for 10 years, it's probably not happening. But it seems like it is in certain cases.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to hear what's gone on there.
Of course, Councillor Smoten, what happens is we have contracts with 2 enforcement agents, and they will go out and we'll have arrangements in place for those businesses which have got outstanding debts. You're correct in your assumption that the older the debt is, the harder it is to collect, and you would think about writing it off. But it wouldn't be prudent of the council, if someone is prepared and has got that cash flow, to be able to recoup those old debts. We will maintain that. Although it sits in some respect to the bad debt provision, we would maintain that recovery process until that business fails to exist or stops repayment.
Any other question? Ian.
Just probably for my clarity regarding sort of empty premises, then having maybe short-term pop-ups in there. I think you do mention about it on the notes, but just for my clarity. So they're may be exempt while it's empty. For the short periods that it's there, the owner is liable for it, and unless it's obviously we have quite a few where I am in Cali. We have quite a few like charity shops, etc. So unless they're an exempt status, and then the owner doesn't have to pay that. Is that how I'm?
Yes. So Councillor Yateman, what happens is you get what's called charity relief. And so that's 80% of the charge would be removed, and then we would pay the extra 20% over on top as a mandatory. So what happens with occupation is the occupation of the property has to be what's called not transient. So you have to have a beneficial occupation in accordance with the regs. You have to see a purpose to it. So if I use this time of year as usually a good example of a pop-up, you tend to get those Christmas shops. And I instantly again think of the Metro Bank that's in the main city centre. We used to have a lot of those Christmas shops pop up there. They would be there for approximately 4 or 5 weeks, and then they would disappear off because the Christmas footfall has come out of the city. Because the occupation was transient, it would stay in the owner's name, and then the owner would be liable for that period. They wouldn't gain the empty property relief. They would be an occupation, but we couldn't assign liability to those occupants. In comparison, so where we have charity relief, the charity relief has to obviously be registered with a charity commission, and there has to be a principle of a charity to it. So when you're looking at pop-ups, or as the report talks about Phoenix businesses, what sometimes you happen in business rates is a piece of case law. It's called to box or not to box. And the principle is whether you're creating an occupation. So another company goes in that's not the owner. They don't actually occupy as such. They put a box in the room that's deemed as then occupation. And you can move that empty property relief. So you have the 3 months, you then wait 6 weeks, and then you get another 3 months again. And it's a principle of tax evasion. The legislation is, well, MHCLG are aware of it. They've made some changes in the legislation already. It used to be, 42 days. They've extended it now to further 3 months to support councils with that extra cash flow. And it's about due diligence, so as a council, by having those robust methods that we have, such as the drone and the people on the foot ground, looking around things, it's then making sure that at the point when that 3 months finishes, we go out to that property and go, where are you? Is that box there, and what's happening? And it's just keeping on top of that, and that good housekeeping that we have in the service to make sure that we've got that right charge.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just looking now on my other screen just to see. I had just 1 or 2 questions. When you look at the formula, I mean, the way that it is described, how from an awful lot of business rates, we end up with a relatively small sum, because at some point, central government suddenly creates thresholds and God knows what to take it away, or maybe if we're lucky, give us something. I don't think they give us anything. What I was going to ask is, are you fully aware of what's actually going on in all those numbers in that formula? i.e., if, for example, something were to change in terms of valuations or in terms of the percentage allocation, or would you be able to simulate changes in government policy, or is it as opaque as it looks to me? Because it as if in the end they decide you're only going to get 8, it was 2 years ago, I think 8% of all business rates. Now, in your calculations, I think it's 12%. But someone somewhere in Whitehall says Oxford only deserves 12, and we will come up with these magic numbers that makes it 12%. Do you know how it's calculated, really, where all those sort of thresholds and God knows what come from?
I think if I can answer that, Chair.
I was just about to say, he's in NDR1.
Yeah. And I think Bill might want to chip in, but I think do we know it's calculated? No more than we know how the rest of the government funding is calculated, really. The main figures here are the shown in that table on page 78.
Well, you give us the numbers. I just want to know, where did they pluck from thin air?
Yeah. They are loosely based on numbers starting from a long time ago when they first brought the retention system in, basically. But that tariff figure is one which is given to us. It's inflated each year, basically. Equally, the business line baseline is inflated, usually by RPI or CPI. That increase basically forms part of what's termed core spending power. Core spending power is a bit smoke and mirrors, basically, as to what you get, because even though they say your baseline business rates is 6.9 million, you're never going to get 6.9 million, basically. It's a totally different figure. So do we know how they're calculated? I think say no more, and that's not a glib answer, no more than we know how the rest of the government funding is calculated, basically. The unfortunate thing is basically we don't get it for more than 1 year. Government talk about multi-year settlements, but that's not from next year on, from until 26, 27 onwards. For the time being, we are given 1 year funding amounts, basically. But yeah, it's a very complicated area, and from the accounting side that Bill and his team have to do, it's even more complicated, actually. But Bill, I don't know whether you want to give a flavour.
Yeah, I don't think I'll necessarily go into a lot of detail on the accounting side because I want people to stay awake after I've finished. But yes, like Nigel says, the actual amount that goes into the tariff, how they've actually calculated that is quite opaque. But once we've got that and it's set, we have kind of a reasonable comfort over what it's going to be in the following year from the point of view of we make an assumption on CPI and that it gets uplifted by that. We then also have to make assumptions on kind of changes in rates, changes in number of exemptions, etc. So there's a lot of estimates that go into the calculation of what ends up in the budget. So I suppose the actual calculation methodology we understand, but there's a lot of assumptions behind it to actually come up with your end result. And we also get the extra added nuances that if the government gives reliefs which aren't included in the original legislation, they then pay us other grants towards it, which we then need to include as part of the calculation of the levy, which takes money off us. So it's kind of a bit of a weird one in that, you know, our business rates gets reduced, but to calculate the levy, we've got to include some grants which we receive to add back in before we calculate the 50% that we pay over. So there's a lot that goes into it, but we know all the different pieces, and if they do make a change, we can work out what the actual implication is once we get the full detail of it.
I guess what I find, and I have to remind people, because I'm sure all of us as councillors lobbied by businesses saying, oh, the dreadful business rates, look how much of an imposition it is on us. And I tell them what a pitiful percentage of it. We get all the opprobrium because we're the collecting agency. It's a bit like council tax. And actually, we're not treated very generously. And in fact, the other kind of questions I have is as you go through the description, and maybe this is one that Laura can explain, you have various things. I'm just looking at the terminology because I might as well get it right. We know about the finder's fee, which in some way seems to be recouped, this 20%. And then, okay, we have collectible debt, and then we have discretionary business rate discounts, where obviously Botley Road businesses are a very good example, I imagine. Where these things are given, how is that shared? Or is it all put into this massive pot and we end up with whatever it is, 5 million, 6 million, whatever is the bottom? I mean, does everyone share in this, you know, the county and the central government in these? And I suppose same for council tax. Or do we suffer if we give a discretionary discount on business rate? Is it all at our expense?
We suffer.
That's what I thought. So if you're kind to businesses in Botley Road, That is our generosity, and it comes out of our notional 12%.
Yeah, so give me 2 seconds and I will just tell you how much we paid. I'm just scrolling down on my spreadsheet. So the discretionary and hardship, we've paid 3 accounts so far this year to a sum of £8,642.
I see, it's not a huge sum.
No, last year we paid 26,000.
Bill's going to chip in, I think. Bill.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add was that the way that the discretionary the discretionary rates or discretionary council tax works is it's actually a charge into the general fund account, because the general fund account has to repay the collection fund, which is where we're collecting the business rates and the council tax. So we actually do a direct transfer, so the full cost hits this council because it has to recompense the collection fund for having made a discretionary relief.
Gosh. I think that's unfair, but that's just me. I mean, so all these other ones like the finder's fee, and there was the collectible debts and so on, are they shared with the other government entities?
No, they are an expense to our council as like an administrative cost of collecting the tax.
So all the time we're being ground down by these things. And then we've got these wonderful Phoenix companies as well.
Yes, Councillor.
It's remarkable we have anything left. Bill.
Yeah, I was going to say there is actually an allowance within the business rates calculation for cost of collection. I think Laura would probably say that it's woefully inadequate for the amount of cost that's actually incurred. So theoretically, it's all paid for through the business rate system. In reality, it's not covered enough.
Yeah, okay. The only thing I would say, Councillor, is that we do have that opportunity through court costs. Not that we encourage people to go into that court cost process. And again, we proactively talk to businesses before getting to that summons level. But we have through the magistrates court the process to say to the magistrates, this is how much it costs us in terms of the collection. Now, that is not from the administrative point of view. That is from the collection point onwards. So once you get to the summons, you can only again give the demonstration of the £160 per case. So you have a summons cost, plus you have what's called the liability order cost, and that part we can attribute, and we have to review that every year. And then we have a spreadsheet should we get called out by the magistrate if we get challenged on those, because again the council could be challenged at the magistrates on how that £160 has been accrued and calculated. But that would be our only way of doing that. So say for example Marks and Spencer's quite happily pay all the way along. The officer that deals with their accounts and all the rest of it, that is through, like as Bill says, that minuscule amount that comes through in terms of that grant, and actually in terms of the council, Nigel's staffing costs actually comes to the burden of us.
Thank you. Last question, actually, which I think is maybe for Nigel or Bill. I remember in previous incarnations of this panel, we have heard about the appeals on business rates, and there were quite a lot, I think, that were associated with Westgate, and there was quite a big sum that was allowed for in the accounts. And I think, I don't have it open now, but I think it's £9 odd million that's floating out there still, that's being, as an allowance, if you like, for such thing. Have we finally dealt with these ages-old appeals, or are they still there? Which, as you explained, Laura, that if they go back to 2010, you would then be accumulating all of that at our expense for the intervening 14 years. Is that correct?
Well, actually, James, the figures given in paragraph 24 of the report, and we use external consultants to advise us on the amount of the appeals provision, and as for 24/5, the amount has been set at 9.9 million. That is the value of appeals provision for appeals that we've established. So it is a huge sum basically.
Yeah.
But that is the sum that we were being advised to set by external consultants, and those external consultants, they tap into what's going in other parts of the country. How are appeals getting on? How successful are those appeals for similar properties in other parts of the country? So they advise us basically, and that's the amount. So it's just short of £10 million that we have set aside as a provision.
And is that, and how far back do they go? I mean, my impression was when we discussed it earlier, it did go back many years. Is it still
15.
legacy from Westgate and so on?
Yeah, it will go back as far. At the moment, we can do check, challenge, and appeal cases outstanding back to 2015. If you because they've been held back based upon that rating list, and they were lodged within the right time frame. And because that, as I said earlier, the backlog the valuation office have got, they're still sitting there waiting to be looked at. Okay, so if, say, for example, you wish to check, challenge, and appeal now, you can only go back as far as your liability of 18 because that's the last list.
Okay, do we have any idea? We don't. This is an expert saying, allowing for probabilities, that is what we should set aside as a contingency.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very much so. But bear in mind that amount is for the whole of the debt, so it's not just our element.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. So in this case, there is, except you've got this magic formula which takes away most of the money and gives it to other people after they've worked out our tariff and everything. I mean, do we end up sharing that 40 or 50%? Or is it, like I said, when you look at the overall thing, we only get, I think this year, 12% of the gross business rates that are collected. What is the proportion that we would be liable for?
Okay, so it would be proportioned because what would happen is we would change the amount that's charged on the business rates to whatever the new rateable value is based upon the challenge. Okay, so you're right, that would be apportioned. The issue we would have though is when you go that far back, those businesses may not be trading anymore. So they may have at the time put that in. So then that's when Bill and his team then have to look at that bad debt provision, because we would have to see, is that organisation still in existence?
Gosh, okay. All right. I know it's complicated, but you've just shown how complicated it is. Are there any other questions? Or maybe we should go on now to the next agenda item, which in the original papers is agenda item 11. May I ask, no, is it, who's going to introduce this? Is it Richard? Who?
Do you want to quick off, Laura, and then Richard, do you want to come in and...
Laura and Richard, yes.
Yeah.
Yep, hello. So supported accommodation, if I could just give you a brief overview of that. Supported accommodation is accommodation which is stipulated in the housing benefit regulations as accommodation which has an element within it that has support costs. And those support costs will be, in order a person to have independent living, it will have what's called general care and support. And although that part isn't paid by housing benefit, there are different types of subsidy rules in terms of how we treat those claims. Now, these claims will never move over to universal credit. So these claims and this expenditure will always be a burden to this council going forward. And what this council is experiencing, which is no different to the national trend, is that the increase in demand in terms of independent living, and this could be because there is a government policy, whether it's with the NHS, whether it's through the Home Office, that people should be able to have independent living and not institutionalised living. But that type of cost should be at the expense of a local authority. So the Home Office and the NHS can discharge their responsibilities in the legislation back to the council to support those people through the housing benefit system to those types of accommodation. Now, in terms of Oxford City Council, we, like Cambridge, for example, we buck the national trend insofar as we have a very high proportion of supported accommodation in our area. And as the benefit service, this is absolutely outside our control. So any expenditure that we incur through this, we have no way, because of the way the regulations are written, to be able to say, yes, we can pay that, or no, we cannot. It's you meet the criteria, you have to pay. So what we have, obviously, Richard and I work very closely. That's why we're both here today. But we work through partnerships, through whether housing commission a type of scheme in the area, or there are other colleagues, as I say, let's take the NHS through Littlemore. They will say that they've got a need, for example, for mental health need, independent living, and there could be 26 people. They will have a huge tower block. 26 people will be in there, and we are looking about rents at the moment in around £400 a week in terms of cost in order to occupy the property. Now, when the council goes and pays that £400 through the housing benefit subsidy system, we have to do what's called a rent officer referral to those cases which are not through a registered social landlord. Yeah. So that would be a housing association traditionally. And as Councillor Turner explained at the very start of the meeting, the problem we have as a city is that there are many registered social landlords that aren't interested in providing that type of tenancy accommodation because it's very expensive, it puts them a burden, and they are stuck in their own regulations to something called the affordable rent level. And they can't deliver that type of intensive housing need in relation to those rental costs. So because private enterprises do that, and often they are charities, that means that the council has to pay 100% towards that rent charge, and then we only get an amount up to a level, and then the extra money to get to that rent is then a loss to the council. So the tenant is never affected by this, but the council's finances are very much affected by this. And what we are doing as a council to try and mitigate that is to try and work with those charities and those other private organisations to say, is this the most affordable rent? So for example, we could be in a 4-bedroom house, it's £2,000 a month rent just to a normal other landlord. Are there other service costs that if you worked with another partner, could you share those costs? Or could you work in other ways to try and mitigate the expense to the council? The council are also, from a benefits point of view, when we look at benchmarking, we also look wider than other than just Oxfordshire, we look nationally. So for example, as the paper explains, we have Southern Vales put people into our area because they haven't got properties in their local area that meets the need of these types of clients. And then it means that they move into the city because that then meets that need. And then the trouble with that is it falls then under Richard's team remit, because if they've lived in the area long enough, when they are able to have a standard general needs tenancy, they meet that locality issue, and it puts then a pressure onto the general needs list, and it puts that housing pressure onto the council to find them other alternative accommodation. You will also find with supported accommodation, we suffer with what we would call terminology of bed blocking. The demand in the city for those types of properties is absolutely nowhere near meeting the demand. And we do get a lot of what we would call London overspill into the benefit service. So because they're not necessarily on universal credit, they will move from supported accommodation in London to move into supported accommodation into our area, such as a women's refuge, for example, because they can't live locally where they are. So because we're in that band of good infrastructure out of big other major cities like Bristol and all the rest, again, we're getting impacted because we can obviously have that reach close enough for other needs. Richard, did you want to come in from a housing point of view here and the Alliance?
Yeah, I think, Laura, you've covered the main arguments. So the bit I would just emphasise is that I think the two main reasons why Oxford has a disproportionate cost in this area is one is the lack of RPs operating these sport accommodation in the city. We're very dependent on charities that then bring this subsidy cost on us. So that's probably the one of the aspects I would emphasise. And the other one is then the geographical spread of supported accommodation across Oxfordshire. If you're the county council, if you're the NHS, you don't worry about district and city boundaries, and disproportionately supported accommodation for all of the needs of the county are being put in the city because that's where services are and existing providers, and they like to have the accommodation close to each other. And then that's putting the cost from all of the districts' need onto us. From a commissioning perspective, we have very limited tools, which this is emphasised in the paper. We do commission some of these organisations ourselves, in particular the Adult Homeless Pathway, the Alliance. Big providers such as Connections and Homeless Oxfordshire are amongst those who aren't RPs there. And we are having very active conversations at the moment with them about decreasing the amount of supported accommodation they're operating, because we do want to move to a model where we have fewer people stored up in hundreds and hundreds of units of supported accommodation, and instead use that investment to move them into a permanent home with support. That's the model we're moving to in the city. So that will help in this subsidy issue as well. Plus, we're having conversations with them about RP status. Can they work better with RPs to get the status, and can they look at better geographical distribution themselves? So that's our direct levers that we do have over about a third of this. The rest, though, is over influencing or partnering. Another big one is the youth pathway that we co-commission with the county council for young homeless people. We are about 5% of that budget, so very limited influence, but we will do what we can to persuade the county to change their approach. And then the real big one is the NHS, the mental health pathway. No direct power over that from the city, but we do obviously have considerable influence with them, and we are having very good early conversations with them about changing their approach around supported accommodation in the city and understanding that geographical mix, and could they work better with RPs in the future. And the arguments that are landing with them aren't just that it would help us, that they are listening to that, but they are very keen because of the issues that Laura alluded to at the end. You know, all of their supported accommodation, the county and health are commissioning it, is blocking up because everyone then has to move on in the city, and we just have insufficient accommodation. When they understand and have explained to them that if they had a better mix and properties in Didcot, properties in Banbury, etc., those people might move on in those areas, and that will then help with their overall move on issues, and that is being listened to. So I think it's going to take time, but we are making progress. So I think hopefully that gives you a bit of a taste of this issue, and I'm sure Laura and I are happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I mean, to me, it sounds as complicated at least as complicated as the business rate reallocations. But Chris.
Thank you. How national is this problem? Is this something where if you went to any sort of medium-sized settlements council, then they're going to be reporting the same sort of thing happening in terms of cases essentially sort of rolling towards the nearest large population centre? Is it particular to non-unitary authorities? In that would obviously mean that there's more common control over things in question. And how much scope do we have to sort of align incentives here in terms of it sounds like we're looking at around an £800,000 a year hole in our budget as a result of this. So in theory, what one might hope to do is to allocate 600 grand to essentially bribing the people in question to take decisions which are more in our interest, and come out with a win-win, if you see what I mean. So obviously, actual bribery, perhaps not. That might not be the best course of action, but alignment of incentives that sort of brings the parties together. Is there a lot of scope to be able to do that?
I'll take that one, Richard.
I'll come in the end, yeah.
Yeah. So, Councillor Smoton, what happens is it depends on the amount of registered social landlords you have in your area. So you will find the problem is greater in towns and cities than it is in rural areas. So, for example, if you had a conversation with West Oxford, they will say what's supported accommodation. They don't have that same impact. In comparison, if you spoke to Cherwell, they will say yes, they've got a lot of problems in Bicester, but not in some of maybe their other areas. What's also quite important when you look at it as a national level is that ourselves and Cambridge, we report quarterly our disdain at the process of the regulations because we are disadvantaged because we don't have registered social landlords in our area. In comparison to Birmingham, so the largest local authority, their loss to supported accommodation expenditure is less than ours. So that gives you an idea that the problem we've got in Oxford is about the registered social landlord. And it's because the registered social landlord gets 100% subsidy, whereas we only get that 60% subsidy, which is where we talk about that 1.6 million loss in terms of housing benefit expenditure. So it's about, in terms of where you're talking about working together and cohesively looking at options. You know, when we look at that commissioning process, you know, Richard and I often talk about, like, could we get a certain organisation that might be interested in doing that? But I think we also have to be mindful that certain housing associations, for example, will have certain specialisms. So they might not have that mental health specialism, which is what our need is in the city. And that is something that very significantly influences who works and is active in your local community. I mean, Richard, do you want to talk about the, you know, cohesive working?
Yeah, so to take all of it, I do think my sense is that being in a two-tier area does is part of this. The county council obviously has a lot of control then of certain forms of young persons and adult supported accommodation commissioning, and they also have a seat at the table on the NHS commissioning, which we don't under a two-tier system. So I do think that's probably part of it. In regards to the financial incentives question, that's an interesting one. We are having early conversations. They're starting to develop now. Conversations with the Alliance about that, really. The Homelessness Alliance, about you know, at the moment, if they move ahead with our plans around decommissioning of units or move into RPs to deliver the units, they don't really see any of those benefits. They all get sucked into the city, and we get lower subsidy rates, so they're not moving particularly quickly. And with lots of other reasons why they're not moving quickly as well, which I won't go into now. But potentially, you know, we are having conversations around recycling some of those savings that we could realise back into grant, if that's possible, to accelerate their moves in this area to get those subsidy savings. But at the same time, that grant will support our strategic objectives as a council around moving to these kind of housing-led, housing-first methods of supporting homeless people, rather than having people, you know, like I said earlier, building up in supported accommodation that they don't move on from. So we'll have to see where that gets to in the coming weeks and months. But I think it's potentially really positive for those providers and for the city. In terms of incentives more widely, we'll have to see how all of this goes. It's still early days in all our conversations with the NHS and the county, but I feel at the moment that we're pushing at a relatively open door, and that there might be potential to make progress in these areas without having to use incentives, and it might just take time to get the RPs active in the market so that they can replace some of the non-RP accommodation, and over time with their commissioning to better disperse accommodation throughout the county.
Sorry,
please carry on.
I was about to say, can I just come in here about possibly the future mapping as well, because that might make a difference. So there is going to be some regulation changes in the coming year, maybe 18 months, about that whole licensing approach to supported accommodation, and maybe working a bit closer together. I have to be honest with you, over the last 6 months, I would suggest I have been reaching out with NHS partners, Home Office, county colleagues to explain the financial burden to this council. And I have to be quite candid here and say they were a bit shocked when they didn't realise that the council wasn't 100% funded, until I pointed out that no, it's because who they're picking in that commissioning process. But there will be some changes coming forward, and so that might protect the city slightly insofar as there is a safeguarding need from the council's point of view, because there will be an annual licence that needs to be applied for when you're looking at supported accommodation. There will need to be a charter that the council will have to create, or the county will have to create, depending on who the commission is, to say this is what our expectations are, and there will be a commissioning process. And what looks like at the moment, at top level table, is that the Housing Benefit Department will have to go out and they will have to monitor these things. So if people are in a tenancy, they're meant to be receiving 10 hours a week care. We as a benefit service will need to go out to make sure they're still receiving those 10 hours a week care. And if they're not, the housing benefit will stop. Now, that's going to have a wider ramification, because I'm not going to lie, it's going to make Richard have a bit of a hot sweat, because they'd all go into temporary accommodation. Because in theory, the power would then be that the licence would be revoked, these people would be made homeless, and the scheme would stop. So there is a huge amount of work from a national level coming in this arena. I don't necessarily think it's going to change the expenditure, which is what this report is talking about, but it's going to give better scrutiny to where this expense is coming from and how we make sure it is being maintained in the needs of the safeguarding of the tenant.
Yeah. I had, in this context, I had two questions, one of which you keep touching on in a way. But the first question is, you have, I think it's called Table 2 on page 90, which shows for the different housing providers, not registered providers, but the different people. And I think the biggest one is Response on that list. I tried and I totally failed to work out from the numbers you gave how much you ended up with, if you like, the final cost to us as councils. Would it be possible to take one or two of those numbers in the table and just show how you worked out the costs, because they are not a registered provider? You had a cost per person per week or whatever it was. I mean, I'd just be glad to understand. It's a little bit like my question in a way about business rates. But more generally, I think it would be good. I think I can follow all the points that you, Laura, you've made, and Richard, you've made. But there must be, at some point, a paper that we should be trying to get our head around. What if we could set up with an appropriate institution to become a registered social provider? Because it's worth a lot of money. I mean, it's really ridiculous that it's some odd rule that has put us in this position, but we are in that position and it's a lot of money. I can see Chris has his hand up. Do you want to add to that?
Go ahead on that one. It's a follow-up to the previous matter, but let's not zigzag topics.
Okay, but those are my requests in a way.
Okay, so if we look at Table 2 and we take the response, so what happens there is the response amount of rent is just under the £400, so it's 393.28. Okay, now the claim-related rent, that's the amount of money the government says they are going to pay up to, because that's the amount of money that the rent service has come back and said. So that gives you the excess of the 227, and then we get a proportion of that back. Okay.
Well, that's the kind of thing. I mean, if you could just do it, and won't be one line, but just do it like a little.
So the loss counter is the 830,000. That is 100. That is the total loss to the council. That end column.
Yeah. No, I understand. I just wanted to understand how you work out the different bits in it, so that, because like I say, when you look at it, it wasn't immediately obvious to me where it comes from.
All right. Okay. So
no, don't do it verbally. Just you could.
No. I was about to say. So that was the example I had on page 6.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll need to have a look at it. I don't have it open right now,
Okay,
but
no, that's fine.
no, thank you.
And Councillor, can I just come back on the last part of your question in terms of
Yes,
help if they could become RPs or if we could create an
yes,
RP or something
yeah.
along those lines? So I've had a number of conversations with a lot of these providers, but in particular response over the last 12 months about what options we do have to support them to help our problem, but they can see it as well that they'll be positioned better in the future to win contracts and to stay in the market if
Yeah.
they're either an RP themselves or they partner with an RP. Now, to do that is extremely both tough and expensive. As a council, you know, as all local authorities now at the moment are experiencing to kind of ensure that we're keeping to the standards of the social housing regulator. A lot of these providers would have to reach those same standards. So it's not an easy process, but we continue to talk to them, and there's a number of kind of ideas that we are trying to develop. And obviously, as those kind of firm up and become more possible, we can obviously share with this panel and the housing panel.
Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, just two quick follow-ups on the previous. On the matter of sort of lobbying government to essentially make the rules less hostile to our particular situation, is there much in the way of coordination with other councils, the district council network or the LGA or things of that sort to this end, or are we a bit on our own on the matter? And on RPs, one of the things that was mentioned in the report was people complaining of the financial difficulty imposed on them by becoming an RP. Could you just elaborate a little bit on what are the financial difficulties, and is that itself a sort of matter to lobby on, or is that just inherent on what it is to be an RP? Is it just an inherently higher quality service that an RP is providing compared to what a non-registered provider is providing?
I'll take the first one, Richard. So in terms of lobbying the government, we are very privileged at Oxford City Council. We sit on our group, it's called the BENEX group. So that's 10 local authorities. And we have every 2 months a meeting with the Department for Work and Pensions. And I can tell you this is always agenda item 4 because there are 2 or 3 of us that are always affected by this significantly. As I say, myself and Naomi from Cambridge. I think that the DWP are very understanding in terms of the problem we have. The issue we have is a bit wider than that, insofar as the Treasury would like the Department for Work and Pensions to cut expenditure. They see very much that local authorities are picking up the tab, and that means that the DWP wouldn't incur more costs. If the Department for Work and Pensions changed the legislation to allow an equal playing field, then the costs to the expenditure nationally would absolutely rocket. And that, I think, is why they're providing these additional regulations for, in a year's time, to try and see if we can equalise out. So there has been a pilot in Maidstone, for example, and out of 10 schemes that they reviewed, they closed 6. So there is definitely an area which the department is looking into, to whether these organisations are scrupulous and doing good value for money in terms of public expense. And it could well be that later in, maybe like 10 years' time, the government will then look to change the regulations. But at this precise moment, the Department for Work and Pensions plus the Treasury are adamant that the regs will not change.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, so coming back on the RP process, yeah, it's pretty much in the nature of being an RP. Having conversations with the different providers, it's a huge upfront investment just to get the legal support to kind of set up all the relevant governance and reporting standards, etc., to bring yourself into compliance. And then beyond that, the costs really do start to add up. In particular around the stock, ensuring compliance, decent home standards, certain services that need to be provided for tenants, etc. It's more of a gold standard, as you say, and to reach that is very tough for sometimes kind of local, not national charities to be able to do that. It might not be impossible, but it will be a long process. And I think for some of the smaller charities, it would be better more to partner with RPs and move away from their current stock profiles, where maybe they're leasing, say, from private landlords to move to one where they might work with an RP, and the RP existing RP provides the stock and they do the support. There is also, and I think this might be something that we increasingly kind of come to confront in the city, is that RP's rents are then governed by the government's rent standard. They regulate the rents, they control the level of rent increases every year, which private charities don't have in the supported accommodation area, and that in itself then limits their ability to invest in a city, because if we say that we want to purpose build X thing, to support a certain client group for supported accommodation within Oxford, they're always interested to have those conversations with us, and then when they find out the land costs in Oxford versus what they can actually charge via the rent standard, it doesn't add up. So these are, there's so many different hurdles in this area to overcome to try to make it work in a very expensive city.
Are we at all concerned about standards of the non-registered providers, in terms of if someone's saying to you there's like a gold standard of service provision and we can't meet that, then what is there a bar they are being held to, which is not the RP level of provision, which we're nonetheless satisfied is adequate in terms of supported accommodation?
Yeah, so certainly within their contracts, they are issued from us or from the county or from health, that is part of it. But Laura, I suppose it's pretty relevant to bring in that the new legislation coming in that looks at standards as well, doesn't it? So
it does, yes.
You're closer to it than me.
Yes, so the new charter is going to be an agreement, in effect a three-way agreement. So it's going to be for whoever is the commissioning authority, who is ever the provider, and who is the tenant. And it's going to be, in effect, a document that says, in order to occupy this property, you will receive this, you will behave a certain way. So there's going to be an element for the tenant that they must demonstrate that they engage, because if they don't engage, then obviously they're taking up the space of somebody who might also need that provision where the demand is high. So there is a three-way contractual process through this charter to make sure that everybody, is taking an active role in it. It's not like you have a commission of 3 years and then you just leave them to it. It's to make sure that we all, have an active approach to it. But yes, I think when we look at it in terms of the administration, it's going to be quite a bureaucratic process. I'm not going to lie, in the initial process. But I think once we go through the first couple of years through this, I think it will start to clean itself down and, have greater transparency, which is actually, in effect, what we're looking for from a housing benefit point of view, because there is some level of smoke and mirrors. Because going back to the point Richard was making about the alliance and different commissioning, if I don't have a good working relationship with the NHS or the Home Office, I don't know what their expectation is I just get a piece of paper in terms of a tenancy and it says this person will receive 10 hours a week care, and that's it. So I really ought to know from this new regulation process is what type of care coming in, is it fit for purpose? And actually the person in that property, do they need that type of care? Because they could be filling up vacancies in properties to get rid of their void charge when actually that person doesn't need that care at all. And then we've got wider problems. And again, that has come out from that pilot that's in Maidstone, because Maidstone has demonstrated that they've got 7 people together, but actually the individual needs are so vastly different that actually some people are in the wrong scheme and it's just not meeting their needs for independent living. So it is going to be quite an area at the moment that's going to drive a lot of conversation and a lot of change, and that definitely could impact us from a financial point of view going forwards.
I'm going to make a suggestion. I mean, I will confess first, I knew that we were only getting the people who are here for the ODS discussion coming in at about 8, and you may notice we've now got other people waiting to join in. So I was glad that we had this discussion, but I think we've had this at some length. But what I would like, and this is actually for both these items in which you have both been involved, I think it would be nice if you could, as I've already requested, summarize the opaque formula in terms of business rate allocation in terms of revenues from it, and just to understand how we are placed. I mean, I'm not asking for a big paper, but I always feel our budget reports are rather dry documents with the best will in the world. And people always question, why are we spending so much on these things? I think it'd be good if there was at least, if not a big paper, something that links to something that is intelligible, that explains how we are losers from the business rate scheme. And if we give discretionary discounts, we're the ones who pay it from our pitiful proportion. But more to the point, this whole discussion about registered providers, if you could summarize it in some form, or again, give a link to somewhere, I would quite like to have that, if not in the full budget report, maybe in the panel report, so that the public may understand some of the constraints under which we continue to operate. And, we do not have unlimited funds given these obligations we have. I think that would be very helpful. But I think we've exhausted the subject somewhat right now. And we've now got the fun and games of the ODS paper to look at. So I'm going to, if I may, thank you both very much indeed for joining us. And in fact, we now have to go. I'm going to ask Celeste to read the formula. We're going to have to go into confidential session. So we have to stop streaming and then we need to go into confidential session.
Sorry, Chair. I just wanted to check whether we've touched on the Treasury Management mid-year review. I don't believe that we've covered
Oh
that.
God, we haven't even done that, have we? Okay, can we do that quickly? I didn't really have many questions on that, so.
I didn't have any questions either, for what it's worth.
Ian?
Okay, well, I mean, if there's no questions, there's not a lot to say, really. I suppose the points to make is that there's a favourable variance year end that's going into the monitoring report anyway, which we've already discussed. And panel did ask for a comparison of our performance compared to our benchmarking groups. And
Which
that's
was,
actually,
by the way, very good. That's the only note I wrote. Thank you very much for the benchmarking paper.
yeah. Thank you, Councillor. And so I think the other comment to make on that is actually that our investments are so low anyway that varying our investment risk probably wouldn't have a great deal of impact anyway, because we're doing internal borrowing. So I would pass over and ask for any questions, but I presume there aren't any given comments.
I think we did read it, but it's fairly straightforward. The only bit I never read is the report from Link or something, how they see the economy, the world economy, the British economy, interest rates going. I mean, that's their opinion, but it doesn't really affect us very well. It affects us, but I don't know I believe what they say.
Fair enough.
But no, well, thank you very much, Bill. Yes, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
No, thanks a lot. So thanks, Celeste, for reminding me. So may we now have
I'm ever so sorry, Chair, but there is still the budget. I'm not sure if you want to take that before we go into closed session or.
I think we agreed that what we're doing is we're inviting questions from the panel by the 9th, so we can combine them and we'll share them, and then they will be sent via Nigel to the relevant officers, so that we can, at our meeting on the 19th, finalize it. But people have a pretty good idea of the kind of questions that are coming through, so they're ready for the first full week in January for all our meetings.
Understood, Chair. That's noted. Thank you.
I think that's okay, isn't it, Ian and Chris? Yeah. Thank you. Okay.